Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're diving into a topic, a perspective, really, that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. We're talking about the argument, and yeah, it's a controversial one, that minimum wage laws might actually be bad for society as a whole.
Right, yeah. I mean, we hear a lot about the good intentions behind minimum wage, the idea that it's meant to help low-wage workers. But we're going to flip the script a little and explore some of the potential downsides and unintended consequences. Some economists, some pretty sharp ones actually, believe these laws can create.
And to guide us on this deep dive, we're turning to the work of Thomas Sowell, a well-respected economist who's really made a name for himself tackling complex economic and social issues. We've been digging into transcripts of his talks, mostly from the Hoover Institution's YouTube channel, where he really lays out his critique of minimum wage.
And that's our mission today. To unpack Sowell's arguments, look at the evidence he presents, and try to do it in a way that makes you think, really think, about this issue. Because it's definitely a hot-button topic with passionate arguments on both sides.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. One of the first things Sowell argues is that when the government sets a minimum wage, it actually messes with, disrupts is maybe a better word, a really crucial flow of information that happens naturally in the economy. And that information is transmitted through wages. And he really believes, that this distortion, this messing with the natural flow, ends up hurting both the overall economy and the very workers the law is supposed to be helping.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because we often think of wages just as the money we get in our paycheck. But Sowell wants us to see wages as a signal too. Kind of like, in a free market, a lower wage might be telling us something. It might reflect what an employer thinks about a worker's skills at that moment. The value they're bringing to the company right then, sort of like a price tag on a product, tells you something about what the seller thinks it's worth.
I see what you mean. And Sowell is pretty blunt about this. He says, and I'm quoting here, "For workers, as for business knowledge transmitted by low prices, wages is generally accurate knowledge, and forbidding its transmission costs both the economy and the intended beneficiary of such price fixing." So he's basically saying a low wages information, just like a low price on, a gallon of milk or something, tells you something about the market.
Exactly. So then the question becomes, what happens when you, step in and prevent that information from flowing naturally? When you artificially raise the wage floor, so to speak? Well, Sowell's argument is that it throws things off. It messes with the ability of both employers and employees to really get a clear sense of where they stand in the market, their relative value. An employer might see someone who's willing to work for, say, a lower wage as a good fit for an entry-level job, a place to learn and get experience. But if the government said, nope, you got to pay them at least this much, it changes the whole equation.
Yeah, that makes sense. If an employer knows they have to pay, let's say, $15 an hour no matter what, they might not be so willing to take a chance on someone who's just starting out, right? Someone with limited skills or maybe a spotty work history. They might say, okay, well, for $15 an hour, I need someone with more experience. Or they might even start looking at automation, robots and machines to avoid hiring those less skilled workers altogether at that higher cost.
And that, Sowell argues, is a big part of why we see so many low-skilled workers stuck in these unstable jobs, jobs that don't last, not a lot of hours, kind of bouncing around. And higher unemployment rates among those folks too.
Yeah.
Because if their wage can't reflect where their skills are at, employers might just see them as too much of a risk at that higher minimum wage.
This kind of leads perfectly into Sowell's second big argument, right? This idea that minimum wage laws can actually lead to fewer jobs overall, especially for those folks who are just getting started. Maybe they don't have a ton of skills or experience yet, or who employers see as, a bigger risk to hire.
This one is really interesting because Sowell is saying, look, in a truly free market, where wages can go up or down based on what a worker brings to the table, there's no reason why someone with, fewer skills should be less employable than someone with a lot of skills. Their wage would just reflect that difference. That's all.
So it's all about letting the market do its thing, basically. And he actually uses a historical example here that's kind of mind-blowing. He talks about how in the US, before minimum wage laws were everywhere back in the day, Black men actually had higher rates of participation in the workforce than white men, even though their skills, on average, were often lower.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. I mean, that's a pretty powerful point. And he says, historically, lower skill levels did not prevent Black males from having labor force participation rates higher than that of white males for every U.S. And then he kind of trails off in this one clip we were watching, but you get the idea, right? He's saying, for a long time, even with those skill differences, black men were out there working more.
And his argument is that the rise of things like, labor unions pushing for standard wages for everyone and the government stepping in with these minimum wage laws, especially later on down south, it changed everything. It messed with that natural ability of wages to adjust based on skills and risk and all that.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like,
Right.
if you can't adjust wages to reflect those differences in skills and, the risk an employer might feel about hiring someone new or inexperienced who ends up getting left out, it seems like, based on what Sowell is saying, it's going to be those folks at the bottom,
Right.
those with the fewest skills, those employers might see as a riskier hire.
And that actually brings us right to Sowell's third argument, which is that minimum wage laws can really hurt teenagers and other young people who are just starting their working lives. They're entering the workforce and they might not have a ton of skills or experience yet.
Yeah, and Sowell uses a really powerful example here. He talks about unemployment rates for black teenagers. And he compares the rates from 1948 and 49, which was, get this, a recession. And he says that back then, the unemployment rate was way lower, a fraction of what it became even during the really good economic times in the 1990s.
And what's interesting is that 1949, that was the last year before the federal minimum wage law really kicked in, right?
Right.
Exactly. That's the key context here. And Sowell says, the federal minimum wage said you must pay every worker at least this much, and when there was no minimum wage kids, everybody, but particularly you're talking now about black teens, could get paid whatever A1. And then he cuts off again, but you can see where he's going. The idea is that without this minimum wage floor, young people, especially those with fewer skills, could find those entry-level jobs, those starter jobs. They could get paid something that reflected their skills at that moment, get their foot in the door, and then, work their way up.
So if there wasn't this minimum wage in place, the thinking is that more employers would be willing to hire those less experienced workers at a lower starting wage, give them that chance to prove themselves and build their skills, kind of like those first few rungs on the ladder,
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, right? Could these minimum wage laws, even though they're meant to help, could they actually be making it harder for young people and people without a lot of skills to get started? It seems like, from what Sowell was saying, that's a real possibility.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and look at Sowell's fourth argument. This one tackles a really common justification for minimum wage, which is, the idea that it stops workers from being exploited, that it guarantees them a basic living wage, right? But Sowell pushes back on this. He says people who use this argument, they're often forgetting about a really important part of how markets work, and that's competition.
Right. Like, the whole exploitation argument kind of assumes that employers have all the power, that they can just pay their workers these super low wages and get away with it. And it sort of ignores the fact that, businesses have to compete with each other for workers.
And Sowell's point is, and this is like Econ 101 stuff, that whenever there's a chance to make a lot of profit, way more than usual, new businesses pop up, right? Like more competitors enter the market.
Yeah, like sharks smelling blood in the water, right?
Exactly. So his argument is, if hiring all these low-paid workers was really such a huge opportunity for employers to exploit people and make tons of money, well, other businesses would jump in, right? They'd want a piece of that action. And that competition, all those businesses trying to hire the same workers, would naturally push wages up. Employers would have to offer more money to attract and keep good workers.
So what he's saying is that, the market itself, the way it works naturally, kind of prevents this widespread exploitation thing that people talk about. If it was really that profitable to hire tons of low-wage workers and, underpay them, then that very profit motive would attract more businesses, more competition, and wages would go up on their own without needing the government to step in with a minimum wage.
Okay, so that brings us to Sowell's fifth and final point, at least the ones we're going to cover today. And this one is kind of the big picture argument. He basically says that the minimum wage is a form of price fixing. And anytime the government tries to fix prices, well, things can go wrong, unintended consequences and all that.
Right, it messes with the natural order of things.
Exactly. And he says that when the government sets a minimum wage, it's basically stopping those natural signals in the economy. The information about how productive a worker is or how risky it might be to hire them, all that stuff gets kind of hidden because the wage can't reflect it anymore. It's like saying, okay, we're gonna set the price of, I don't know, bicycles at $500, even though some might be worth way more and some might be worth way less based on their condition and features and all that.
Yeah, it's like you're taking away the nuance.
Yeah, exactly. And he contrasts that with other ways to actually help low-wage workers, you know? He says investing in education, making job training better, helping people develop their skills, that kind of stuff, that can lead to people being more productive, and then their wages will naturally go up because they're bringing more value to the table. It's different than just, setting a minimum wage and calling it a day.
Right, he's all about addressing the root causes, not just putting a Band-Aid on the problem.
Exactly. But just like setting this artificial wage floor, a minimum wage based on, I don't know, politics or whatever, instead of what's really happening in the economy, how skilled workers are, what value they bring to their employer, well, it can create the situation where employers are less likely to hire people if their work isn't worth that higher wage. It's a tough spot for those workers.
Yeah, definitely something to think about. And it's important to remember here that Sowell isn't against higher wages. What he's worried about is the government getting involved in a way that prevents wages from reflecting what's really happening in the economy. And he thinks that kind of interference can actually hurt the people who are most vulnerable in the job market.
So, big picture, just to sum up all the stuff we've talked about today from Thomas Sowell. Minimum wage laws, they can mess with the information that wages tell us about the economy. They might actually lead to fewer jobs, especially for people with lower skills or less experience, and they could end up hurting teenagers and other young people who are just starting out in their careers. Plus, the whole argument that minimum wage prevents exploitation, well, it ignores the fact that competition between businesses can naturally push wages up anyway. And so Sowell really sees minimum wage as a form of price fixing, which, as we've discussed, can have some unintended negative consequences.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive, hasn't it? And just to reiterate, we've really focused on one perspective today, the one presented by Thomas Sowell. This is a super complex issue with a ton of different viewpoints and arguments.
And that's a great point. So here's something to chew on as we wrap things up. Think about the bigger picture, the whole idea of the government getting involved in the economy. Even when it's done with good intentions, like with minimum wage laws, could those policies actually create unintended problems? Problems that end up affecting the very people they're trying to help?
That's a big question, right? It really makes you think about the role of free markets, how prices work, including wages, and how all that impacts things like how many jobs there are and how well the economy is doing overall. We hope this has made you really think about this important topic, and we encourage you to do your own research, explore different viewpoints, and keep the conversation going.